Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Security Dilemma, a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. I'm Adam Abdelkader, a program assistant here at the Society, filling in for my colleague AJ Manuzzi in today's episode. I'm joined by my co-host John Allen Gay as we have a conversation with John Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay is an associate professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Cybersecurity and Privacy and the Samnon School of International Affairs. His research focuses on the role of emerging technology in global security. He holds a PhD in political science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he's the author of Age of Deception, as well as several other influential works on cyber conflict and strategy. Previously, he served in the U.S. Navy with operational assignments in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. In this conversation, we discuss his new book, Age of Deception, as well as China and Iran's cyber capabilities, AI, and the myths and realities of cyber itself. Join us as we have a conversation with John Lindsay.
Dr. Lindsay, welcome to Security Dilemma.
Thanks very much. Great. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with your new book, Age of Deception, Cybersecurity as Secret Statecraft. Are we living in a dangerous new era of cyber warfare with hackers having new advantages over defenders in an anarchic cyber realm? Both states and citizens should be terrified at this mighty new cyber weapon that is going to define the future of warfare.
Okay. Well, I think we're living in dangerous times, but that has much less to do with technology than is widely appreciated. Cyber technology and cyber warfare are often talked about as new things, but cyberspace has been emerging for over 50 years now. So I think it's fair to say that cyberspace is properly emerged. And so we have a pretty good understanding of what this looks like right now. And part of what it looks like is having this constant din of hype and expectation about what the latest cyber developments are going to look like, what the latest hack may portend for the future. And yet we have this, I think, stabilizing understanding of what the technology is useful for. I think that we're going to see, and we already see, plenty of cyber activity, but is it revolutionary in kind of some fundamentally politically disruptive sense? Probably not.
Yeah, just to take a step back, what is cyber? Like you defined this in the book, and I actually thought it was very useful. I'm a more traditional mill power / area studies guy. So I thought this was helpful.
Yeah, thanks. I laughed because I was so happy that you asked that question because I really like the etymology of cyber. I think it's very, very revealing and completely lost in kind of defense discourse where people just say cyber and it kind of signifies all of these strange mysteries and technical wizardry that we don't quite understand. But if you go back to that actual word, right, cyber comes from cyberspace, which is William Gibson's famous novel. But he was just riffing on cybernetics, which was this kind of hothouse of ideas around control and information and feedback in World War II and the years after. And the focus was on, can we come up with general principles that hold across robotic machines, human organizations, biological organisms? And the focus was on systems that could take in information or sense. They could compute or integrate that with information in their memory, and they could act in the world. And so this was the kind of fundamental cybernetic decision loop. That word cybernetics was coined by Norbert Wiener, a mathematician at MIT. And he kind of reached back into ancient Greek and pulled out the word kybernetes, right, which is the word for steersman. Actually, Plato uses kybernetes to kind of refer to the ship of state. In the Republic, there's a whole thing about what the technology of statecraft looks like, and they use this word, right? So in that sense, cybernetics, kybernetes, it's the same root that we get government, right? So gubernatorial, cyber, right? It's really fundamentally about control. right? So cybernetics was the science of control. And I think cyber technologies are fundamentally technologies of control. They allow you to control your communication, your programming environment, your industrial appliances, perhaps, discourse about political topics, whatever it might be. But if once you start thinking about cyber as control, it gets us away from this focus on the digital technology and more about what cyber has always been, which is communication. And in a security context, right, we're talking about the contestation of control. So we're trying to hijack control or shape it or block it. All of these things come to the fore, but I think it really helps to focus us on like what is the strategic purpose of this technology rather than just starting with a technological definition.
Yeah, and that kind of gets to a second question, which is cyberspace anarchical?
um, Yeah, right. So there was a lot of, about 10 years ago, there was kind of an explosion of writing that really talked about the anarchic nature of cyberspace. Somebody described it, hey, it's kind of like Mogadishu, right? It's like Somalia. And I think this is a deep misconstrual of the nature of cyberspace. I mean, when we say cyberspace, what are we talking about? We're talking about the internet. We're talking about connected devices. We're talking about computational practices. What are these? These are human-built environments that rely on protocols, programs, files, folders, registries. I mean, those words are the words in the language of bureaucracy, right? Bureaucracy is the opposite of anarchy, right? It is all about control. It is all about institutionalization. So when you look at what we've been able to do, humanity, right, with large-scale information systems over the past 50 to 100 years, right, we are creating an unprecedented degree of institutionalized channels and protocols to coordinate, human interaction and communication. So this is very much the opposite of anarchy, right? In IR terms, we're looking at a densely institutionalized space.
And so, one of the applications we at the Society did a reading group on your book. And one of the questions that I asked our attendees was, hey, let's apply the theory in this book to some of these new AI tools like Anthropic's Mythos that allegedly are just like super powerful at finding cyber vulnerabilities in a way that like humans cannot at the same speed and scale. And there was a lot of fear in the press that this means we're about to enter a new era of like super hackers. Everything's going to be really vulnerable. Watch out. These new tools are coming. And so I asked folks, how would Dr. Lindsay apply this? So now I'm going to ask you, how are you thinking about these tools like Mythos based on the theory and the casework that's in your book?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mentioned, I think the answer to your first question, one of kind of the staples of cyberspace, cybersecurity over the past 50 years is this constant drumbeat of hype. And so now, that hype is all around AI generally, Mythos in particular. You can almost find and replace some of the claims about Mythos and find those in the 1990s, in the 2000s, talking more about cyber warfare and cyber disruption, or even about quantum computing. And so, as a social scientist, when I see the same claims being made about very different technologies and yet attributed to the technology itself, that tells you that there's something other than technology doing the work, right? So, and I guess the only other kind of prefatory remark I'd say, there's this classic and ridiculous graph in the Financial Times. You've probably seen it. I'll explain it for your listeners, right? And it's charting the potential trajectories of AGI. And it's got time on the horizontal axis, and it's got capabilities on the vertical axis. And it says, well, one possibility is we'll get super intelligence, and like this line goes off the charts. And one possibility is this is nothing new here, and this is all hype, and and it goes totally on to the ground. And then like maybe it's somewhere in between, right? You're like, well, that is the most ridiculous chart of all times. And Mythos is kind of the same way. Either it is this absolute disaster for cybersecurity, we're able to point it at any application and say, find me some zero-day vulnerabilities, right? This is kind of the the reactive material to cybersecurity. Or hey, this is all Anthropic hype preparatory to their IPO, and there's really nothing new here. Or maybe it's going to be somewhere in between. Okay, so like there is something happening here, right? But it's not, really either of those things. And I think that the key thing to recognize is that, when you introduce a technology, you're introducing it into, a live political environment. And if you provide a little bit of advantage to one side, then the other side is also going to be looking for advantages. And, the offensive advantages are still notional, poorly understood. Offensive groups are having to experiment and play with those. When you experiment and play, you make mistakes, you make a big public signal. Defenders are learning a lot about this. This is why we're talking about Mythos, right? So there's all kinds of effort to try and implement counters and, defensive protections against that. So all of that's going on, right? So you can have a tremendous amount of activity on both sides and yet end up with this really sort of static trajectory. So for a long time, what we've seen is a world of kind of cyber insecurity that tends to advantage really talented offensive actors and really, really kind of robust and dedicated defenders, and then leaves everybody else very, very exposed. So it's kind of this K-shaped curve of like the strong get stronger, the weak get more vulnerable. And I think we'll see something similar with Anthropic, right? It's providing some incredible defensive capabilities. There's going to be some offensive teams that will be able to really use it in some very, very creative ways. But it'll be really, really difficult to kind of be on the low end and go against the high end. But if you're on the high end going against the low end, then it's going to be, increasingly dangerous. So, I'm kind of doing the wishy-washy academic thing and saying it's a little bit of both. But I do expect this to be broadly consistent with general trends that we have. And I guess the one last thing I would say is that, the thing that Mythos seems to be good at is, finding vulnerabilities. Now, there's still a ton we don't know because Anthropic is still very secretive, right? There was this big report that, Firefox found, 232 vulnerabilities, but then they only reported like 10 of them during their security update, and none of them were attributed to Anthropic. So you're like, well, what kind of vulnerabilities are you finding, right? Like they're not actually important enough to put in your really security advisories. So that, we don't actually know what's being found. But I'll also say that like finding the vulnerability, I mean, like that's just one of, 30 different steps that have to happen in, engineering a useful offensive exploit. And so that is still going to be a challenging, complicated task that's going to take a lot of human judgment and engineering. The general trend that I describe in the book is kind of an increase in complexity, but really, really ambiguous implications for either side. So I do expect some continuity with AI in that regard.
Yeah, and getting to that ambiguity, as I read the book, you're sort of pushing back against a cyber war narrative that like new cyber power is going to dominate and transform the way that war is fought. And we should principally, I think, understand cyber in terms of war as a tool of war, et cetera. And you're saying instead it is primarily a tool of secret statecraft. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I'd say two things on that. I mean, I'm definitely pushing back against the war framing, but it's important not to misunderstand what I'm talking about. I am not saying that cyber is not useful in war. I mean, it absolutely is. We've seen that in Venezuela and Iran for sure. What I am saying is that for analyzing the dynamics of the domain, a lot of the language we have around attack, defense, denial, conquest, deterrence, coercion is misleading in this space, right? And the book is called Cybersecurity as Secret Statecraft because I wanted to, as a political scientist, ask, well, what politically is this useful for, right? It's very rare that anything new comes up in politics, right? You can find most of what you need to find in, Thucydides and Sun Tzu. So what is this, right? Like, well, by first order approximation, we're looking at new technical means for espionage, for covert action, for sabotage, for propaganda and information operations. What is that, right? So I kind of went to the IR literature, and there's people that have written on intelligence organizations and intelligence policy relations, but I mean, it is a minuscule literature compared to, the vast amount of writing we've got on war, peace, deterrence after the nuclear revolution. So the argument of the book is cyber is important, not because it's new, but it makes newly important this very old set of patterns that have been around, since the dawn of humanity. And this has to do with deception, subterfuge, conspiracy, espionage, right? All of the James Le Carre kind of dark arts, right? And you can find that in Sun Tzu, you can find it in Kautilya, in the Indian tradition. So it's there, but it just hasn't been part of the IR theoretical landscape. And I think it's really, really important. And the advent of these really dense institutionalized cyber spaces that we talked about before creates all kinds of new, interesting opportunities for secret statecraft. And I make the analogy in the book to the nuclear revolution, right? It's not that deterrence was brand new when nuclear weapons were introduced in the mid 20th century, right? Deterrence, again, that's in Thucydides as well, but deterrence became essential because you just dared not use a nuclear weapon in war itself, right? But nuclear weapons can be really useful for threats. And so suddenly scholars had to say, oh, there's a difference between war fighting and threatening war. And so now we have this vast, lexicon on deterrence. And I argue that something similar and opposite has happened with cyber security, right? We've got now these dense institutional interactions and protocols and ways of communicating at scale. And this is creating all kinds of possibilities for deception. And so now we have to talk about deception being different than defense. What does that mean? How does it work? So on and so forth. So secret statecraft is kind of just gesturing towards this enduring, but I think underappreciated, under-theorized category of international relations.
So within that term, secret statecraft, you identify kind of 4 types of strategic effects throughout the book. And to outline those, you also bring up 4 or so case studies, including Bletchley Park, Stuxnet operation, the Russian interference campaign in 2016, and also just Chinese hacking campaigns. I'm curious if you could give an example of one of those types and also one of those case studies, and maybe bring up the one that is most emphatic to the argument you're kind of putting forward.
Identify kind of 4 different kinds of secret statecraft. And, they actually relate to the kind of other strategies, right? So the purest form of secret statecraft is espionage. This is intelligence collection. I say it's the purest form because the best spy is the one that the victim never detects, never understands, right? Is in place and persisting for a long period of time, but doing a little extra on the side. They're siphoning out information. So they keep the enabling institutions, the enabling organizations, the enabling digital systems in place, doing their work for the target organization, but you're bringing things out, right? So you're competing within this cooperative institutional space. So that's kind of the purest analytic form of secret statecraft. Now, if you move from secret statecraft towards warfare, right? This means we're now looking at breaking institutions, disabling institutions, exiting from them, making it hard for people to use their organizations. That also means it's harder to hide, right? If things are breaking, like they're going to tend to be revealed. So as we move from secret statecraft towards warfare, right? I call that sabotage, right? These kind of the disruptive parts of covert action. As you move kind of more from secret statecraft towards deterrence, which is the opposite in many ways, you get into what I call subversion, but that's propaganda, information operations, hacking minds instead of, hacking machines. And the reason I say it's on the way towards deterrence is you're trying to do this really, really hard thing with information operations and saying like, hey, I'm sending you a signal because I want to shape your thinking, but I want to obfuscate who it comes from or what its true intent is, right? So I want to be both out in the open sending signals, but obfuscating those signals. And that's hard, right? I mean, like, deterrence is all about sending credible signals. And here you want to send signals that are believable, but like not attributable. So you're kind of in this bind, right? So it's there. And then the fourth one is as you move from espionage towards, peace, coordination, regular institutions, you want to protect institutions from all of this other stuff. So you want to use espionage, usually we call that surveillance and monitoring, kind of all the counterintelligence armamentarium. So kind of a long answer there, but I just wanted to paint like theoretically there's a justification for why you've got these 4 different kinds, right? So espionage, sabotage, subversion, and counterintelligence. So, I guess, you asked for an example. Since I said espionage is the purest form, I'll take that one. And one of my favorite case studies in the book is the Bletchley Park case study. And it's so interesting in so many ways. And, we could do an entire couple of podcasts just on Bletchley Park, right? One reason is, I think it's the first candidate case of kind of cyber cyber competition, right? It's the first place where you've got intelligence interactions that are by, with, and through computing machines, many of them electrical, mechanical, but you also see the emergence of the first electronic machine in the Colossus code-breaking machine. So historically, it's fascinating, right? It's kind of the first application of computer science. They don't even have that word at that point, but like computer science concepts and machines to the intelligence contest, the signals intelligence contest of the Second World War. And Bletchley Park is amazing, right? Because it was incredibly successful for years on end, right? And this is very rare in the intelligence world, right? Now, part of that's a selection problem, right? We only hear about the failures because those are what are exposed. Bletchley Park is this case that, it's now old enough that archives are open. We can kind of see inside of it. We can understand how it works. We can also look at the other side, see how the Germans didn't see it, ignored it, overlooked it, diminished it, right? And so, like, we've got a lot more fidelity on how this kind of signals intelligence contest actually worked on both sides. And if you want, I can go kind of into more depth on why it worked, but like it is just such a great case for illustrating kind of the fundamental principles of successful intelligence performance, which is the operational implementation of secret statecraft, that really work well in this non-digital environment. And I think you can just carry those principles forward, right? You had very vulnerable and in many ways kind of cooperative adversary. I mean, the funny thing when you read about intelligence history in the Second World War, you're constantly struck by like how many mistakes the Germans made. I mean, like Germans were just the best intelligence target possible, right? I mean, like, their counterintelligence was awful. They'd made all kinds of mistakes. They were very predictable and Germanic in certain ways, right? So they were the ideal intelligence target. And then GCCS, the Government Code and Cipher School, Bletchley Park, right? They just invested a ton in building, what really is the model for modern signals intelligence. I mean, they set the pattern for what became GCHQ or NSA, right? So it's just a really cool case because you just see those things come together. We've got the permissive environment and then a dedicated investment in the resources and talent to make it happen.
Yeah, well, and that gets to one of what I took as a key line of the book. Institutional context determines intelligence performance. What did you mean by that? And I think we're kind of hearing it come out here.
Great. So, I mean, this goes back to your earlier question of like, hey, why isn't this cyber warfare, right? And so when I think about war, right, and kind of the classic, IR context, right, we think about, Ken Waltz, Morgenthau, right? This is the realm of anarchy, and anarchy is dangerous because anything can happen, right? And any actor can attack you. Therefore, you need to help yourself to defense. But if you help yourself, you become threatening to others. So this is a story of, politically autonomous units that are, gathering their own resources, borrowing, stealing, developing, right, and creating military power, which they may use on other. And when they go to war, right, it's these two states or autonomous organizations that are going to bash it out on the field of battle. Right. So each side is going to have very complex institutions. They got organizations, doctrine, command and control systems, civil military relations, all of that stuff. Right? But you don't share those institutions with the other side, right? You're trying to defeat, destroy, like dictate terms to the other side, right? Impose your institutions. And that is like fundamentally different from the way intelligence works, right? Intelligence is, I'm going to take a spy, all right, or my electronic device, and I'm going to put it into your organization. And your organization is the fundamental environment, right? It's less the geography, it's less, kind of like fighting. Like I'm going to be hiding within your language, within your practice, within your culture, within your systems, right? So those things need to exist to provide the environment for me to infiltrate and subvert. And I think that this just means that you've got a fundamentally different political logic between war, which is this contest of strength between autonomous institutions, and intelligence, which is this contest of infiltration and wits, right, between deeply entangled institutions. And that means that if you're looking for intelligence opportunities, right, you need a cooperative target, right? You need something that is going to provide you that culture, that organization, those systems that have vulnerabilities that you can exploit, right? It's not like you can just, send your tanks across the border and occupy the other side. They need to present the opportunity for you to infiltrate. So institutions create the environment, and then you also need institutions to exploit it. So it's these two things, right, that provide, when I'm talking institutional context, I'm talking about the interaction between organizations and their environment, both of which are, fundamentally human built.
Yeah, and so kind of going back to that case of Bletchley Park, you had effective clandestine organization in Bletchley Park. They were well built for doing what they were doing. And then vulnerable institutions on the other side, namely that the Germans were bad at counterintelligence, but also like they were broadcasting these messages. The British could listen to them and record them and, tabulate them and all that and exploit that.
Yeah. Right. So, kind of the vulnerable institutions, I kind of break it into these two pieces, connectivity and vulnerability. And in that case, right, I mean, it's just the physics of radio, it goes everywhere, right? So if you're broadcasting and the enemy has listening stations, they're literally in your network. And everybody understands this since World War I, and the Germans believe that because we've got these newfangled mechanical encryption machines, right, we're going to broadcast our traffic, but the content itself will be denied. Well, you've got the other side that can collect all that information. They can do traffic analysis, which even if you don't understand the content, you can really learn a lot about the other side. Who's broadcasting, who seems to be the headquarters, where are the field units, which units are support. So I mean, they can figure a lot out looking at call signs and traffic patterns. And then the British, right, were able to understand how these machines worked and find both technical and then more the social vulnerabilities, because the Germans were not following their own communication security doctrine, right? So you had lots of, tired, complacent, lazy, upset, frustrated radio operators. Just imagine the typical German soldier, tired, wet, hungry, trying to do things. And they're going to start taking shortcuts. And Bletchley Park understood what those shortcuts were and were able to use those to systematically break into these networks day after day, week after week, and maintain continuous access. So if you didn't have that connectivity, which means you could access all the traffic, and you didn't have these technical and social vulnerabilities, you wouldn't have had the possibility to get access to any of this. But then Bletchley Park had to build an entire organization around it. And then, one of the most remarkable things is that they kept it secret for so long, right? Because it was purpose built around the vulnerabilities of the Enigma and Lorentz machines. You had 10,000 people, all of these machines. The machines were designed exactly hand in glove to kind of counter the German machines. So, had that been discovered, right, you could have, eliminated that entire investment. So you had to build it, understand it, and then maintain it and protect it. And and that's what the Germans did really well. So sometimes they talk about, hey, you have to be really, really lucky in intelligence, and luck is when preparedness and opportunity meet, right? So the enemy can give you the opportunity, but you've got to have your own organizations prepared and able to exploit it.
And then you talked a bit about how, okay, you can have your kind of ideal case is a vulnerable enemy against one of these capable adversaries. What happens when one or two of those variables starts to change?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm a political scientist. We're simple people, so we have kind of 2x2s for everything. So, you can imagine you can have, an institutional environment that is vulnerable or closed, secure. There's different ways to talk about that. And you can have your organization, which is sophisticated, which means they've got OPSEC and capabilities, or something. So there are these different combinations. And we've been talking about Bletchley Park, which is that really sweet spot. But you can also have, and we've got this in spades today, targets and networks and organizations that are very aware of their security. They're taking efforts to put in place doctrinal and technical barriers to try and keep hackers out. Maybe they're even putting, physical barriers to access. Okay, so, if you've got a terrorist organization that goes to couriers, okay, then signals intelligence doesn't matter anymore because nobody's chattering, right? Now you're going to have to somehow intercept that individual or use human intelligence, okay? So there are lots of things that you can do to make the environment less accessible. So in the Stuxnet case study, which, we can talk about more, but just kind of in a nutshell, right? This was a thing where like there were air gaps, meaning that the Iranian nuclear program was not directly connected to the internet. So there's a physical boundary that the attackers had to get over. There certainly were some security protocols, so you needed to identify and evade those in order to get to these more remote vulnerabilities. But that means that you have to have more complex operations that are going to be usually slower, more deliberate. They require more careful planning, more kind of extensive monitoring, right? So this is a situation where you can have a sophisticated organization, you can have a hard target, and that means that your operations tend to be more complex, which means there's all kinds of more, potential for failure. The converse possibility, right, is where you can have a wide open, vulnerable situation, so a great target, but you can have an organization that is not super capable. Maybe they're just downloading their exploit tools off of the internet. They're relying on hackers that they do not pay or control or motivate directly. Maybe they are just totally, lazy about their operational security. And then you're really at risk of just losing control, right, of compromising the entire thing. If you're not taking, care to keep things secret, then it's much more likely that you're going to send, signals to kind of all the counterintelligence antibodies that are out there. So I kind of use the 2016 Russian interference in the U.S. election as kind of the paragon of this case, where you had, wide open, vulnerable American cyberspace, very few kind of limitations on the content layer. And so the Russians could very easily, produce a lot of flammable, politicized content, but they're pretty noisy about the way that they did that. So, the Russian operation itself kind of emerged, kind of mid, in the summer, so months before the actual election. So this is an example where, yes, you've got vulnerabilities, but the organization itself is not super professional in exploiting them.
And the big question as of today, you talk about it in the book, Chinese hacking. I'm wondering how big of a threat you think China is and its hacking ability, maybe even amongst its non-state actors and the state level actors like inside the PLA.
Yeah. So I mean, everything in China is complicated, and cyber is no exception. I used kind of China as, obviously it's substantively critical because this is the major adversary for many kind of practical cyber actors. But it was also an opportunity to step up from the operational level to the strategic or grand strategic level and think about cyber operations in a very different national context. Because we, kind of talking a lot about, Western operations, Western context. And when I talked about kind of like the emergence of cyberspace, cybersecurity, that was largely, a Western story of building kind of the technical correlates of liberal order, if you will, right? And China's interesting because they said, well, we'll take that, thank you very much. And we like the economic parts of liberalism, like we like to trade, and we like to exploit your openness to trade for our unfair advantages. But we don't like the political openness, so we're going to unbundle that, right? And that was very surprising. Lots of people, if you remember back in the 90s, were like, if we connect everything will be free, right? Information, cyberspace detects censorship as damage and routes around it. And there were all of these like really, idealistic stories of kind of the inexorable march of liberalism across cyberspace. And China has, proven quite clearly that no, it is possible to unbundle economics and politics, right? And have an open, digitally connected society that is, deeply enmeshed in the global economy, and yet totally locked down politically. And the way they've been able to do that is just absolutely fascinating, right? So it kind of, again, it really helps to make this argument that institutions matter because we go to a different institutional context and suddenly we're seeing things happening in a very different way. Now, okay, so this question, is China a threat? Well, China is the paramount great power rival to the United States. So of course it's a threat, right? It is a competitor in every domain you could possibly think. It would be very surprising if cyber and intelligence were not included as well. right? So, now that we recognize secret statecraft as being an important thing, we can look back in history and be like, oh my gosh, intelligence contests were always there in the shadows, right? They were a fundamental part of what it meant to be in a great power rivalry. Okay, you can see this in Thucydides too, right? There actually are some interesting kind of subterfuge and hijinks that are going around. Okay, so yes, China is a huge intelligence threat, but I said that intelligence and military are different, right? You actually want great powers to have robust intelligence contests. Right now, this is a headache for anybody that's on the defensive side. It is a headache for anybody that is working in a three-letter agency, and I don't want to minimize that work at all. Right? I want them working really, really, really hard, both to defend and to penetrate the other side. But we want great powers competing in a non-kinetic way. We also want them learning about each other, right? And we also want them to have ways of kind of letting off steam and relieving pressure in what could otherwise be a very, very dangerous set of interactions. So I guess I would say that, yes, China is an important intelligence threat, right? The intelligence contest is intense, but it doesn't mean that China has fundamental advantages, right? One of the things I think that's happening is that, yes, China's technical operations are getting far more sophisticated than they were, even 10 years ago. But that's because they have to be, right? Because US defenses and the global cybersecurity industry have gotten much more sophisticated at the same time. So, I often use this kind of Lewis Carroll metaphor of the Red Queen race, right? Where you have to run as fast as you can to stay in the same place, right? That's kind of cyber. Yes, China's getting more sophisticated, but they have to. Right, so it's more an indicator of the intensiveness and the complexity of the intel contest than this kind of gathering threat. Kind of harken, same theme as the AI story. Now, I think where China really, really excels, right? If you want to say here's the clear, Chinese advantage, it is in their domestic information control regime, and it's really, really interesting to contrast Chinese internally directed information control and Russian externally directed influence operations. So you look at Russian influence operations, you're like, well, it's busy and noisy, but everybody's looked and you just can't find it that they're actually moving the needle, right? They're preaching to the converted, they're making a lot of noise, but they're not actually doing anything. Look at China, you're like, people are very, very concerned, right? You're paying attention to the propaganda, you're paying attention to control because the Chinese internal security services will come and visit you if you step out of the roads. And that's the thing that China has that Russia's missing, right? If all you have is information and you've got no physical force to back it up, it's not credible, it's not a useful signal. China can be very effective internally because it has these goals for locking down society and reinforcing the control of the CCP, and they've got the People's Armed Police and the Ministry of Public Security in order to make that happen. So they complement each other really, really well. And it really, kind of exemplifies this theme that we talked about, that if cyber is about control, the places where states have lots of control are the places where cyber is probably going to provide a political advantage, right? Now, this is not the usual asymmetric story where hackers and terrorists are going to use cyber to do great things. This is the strong state using these information tools to further, reinforce its political control.
I heard you say that asymmetric story. I feel like there seems to be a lot of hype in Washington when you have conversations with people around, just saying that, the prospects of Chinese hacking and pre-positioning in our networks, in the case of a conflict or crisis, might actually be a really big concern. Some start to cite the Volt Typhoon use of living off the land techniques in Guam utility and critical infrastructure, saying basically China is going to turn off the lights if we have a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And my main question would be do you think the cyber domain would ever be a decisive factor in a conflict with China? And if it's not decisive, how much do you think it would contribute? Kind of hitting on that military aspect.
Yeah, a lot of things in there. Is China interested in this? Yes. Will they be able to pull it off? That's a more complicated question. We're not talking at all about what the US is doing on the same time to pre-position capabilities or to counter these capabilities, right? So, I mean, there's always this one-hand clapping aspect of kind of talking about Chinese cyber, like we're always ignoring that, the same stuff is happening as well. So, the fact that we're talking about Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, right? Yes, it means the Chinese are doing things. It also means that we're discovering them, right? And we're having the ability to go in there and, discover more things like them and do the mitigation, right? There is much more emphasis since 2018 on threat hunting and forward operations, both in the government and in industry. So like that is actively contesting the ability of kind of like Chinese operators to do things. Now, a key point that I, make in the book is that to have a weapon, right, means that you've got to have a capability that you can anticipate its effects and you can assure the commander that it's going to be useful in real world situations, right? And we can do that with bombs because we can test them hundreds of times on a range in situations that are very similar to delivering ordnance in war. It's hard to do that in cyber because every operation is sort of custom tailored to the particular target for all the reasons that we've talked about before. So when you come to the commander and say, I've got this magical cyber wizardry stuff, and the commander is probably some infantry or naval guys like, I don't really understand that. I don't trust you, geek. Like go away, right? Unless you're deeply integrated, and we've been doing this for a long time, right? I'm not going to bet the farm on that thing. And anybody that actually has that capability knows, right, that, oh my gosh, this target set is so complex, right? It's going to be reactive and adaptive. They might not even have the confidence to go to the commander and say, we're absolutely sure that, we can do this and this will be the silver bullet. So, when I'm talking to students, I always say, like, you've got to distinguish how things happen and why things happen. And the how is always harder than we expect because it's not just technical. And the why, right, is fundamentally political because you've got to take into account this strategic interaction. So, again, I think that this is a contested space, but it does not, clearly accrue to the Chinese side.
Well, and kind of rounding off on that, does cyber success equal strategic success? Does intelligence success equal strategic success?
Yeah. The short answer is no, right? And this is one reason why, I kind of split the book between secret statecraft. What is this thing strategically? How can states use it? And then what most of the book spends its time on is intelligence performance, and that is, well, doing this at the operational level. And my definition for intelligence success is establishing and protecting secret information channels that you can use for sucking information out or pushing instructions in. That is a very narrow, operational accomplishment. It's sort of like, this is the minimal thing you need to do in order to have an intelligence or cyber operation. What does that mean in the long run? Could be nothing, right? Maybe you have great access, but the target's not that important, or you're getting this information and your policymakers decide not to act on it, right? Or you're compromised somewhere else along the way, or it becomes irrelevant, right? So there's lots of reasons why intelligence success could become overcome by events at the political level. Same thing in war, right? I mean, we've seen the United States be very successful tactically, operationally, and yet, we've got a political and strategic disaster in the Middle East. So, that's not just an intelligence thing, but I think it's very, very clear. Now, I think the book punts on this question a little bit because I needed to just kind of focus on that operational level because nothing existed in that space. Each of the case studies kind of definitely talks about the effectiveness part and kind of does it in an ad hoc way. But there is this gap, and I think there's a bunch of opportunity for kind of theorizing the link between political and operational effectiveness. But the short answer is no, they're very, very different. Maybe I'll just say, I mean, my interpretation of Stuxnet, which I think, maybe is a little different than some of the stuff we hear out there. There's a lot of people that kind of cast aspersions on hey, this didn't actually take down the Iranian nuclear program that Iran kept enriching. I agree with that, right? A long time ago, I was kind of skeptical about Stuxnet as well. So you could say hey, this did not really achieve its operational objectives if we assume that those are sabotage, right? Because Iran keeps enriching. But I think its political objective, and there's lots of circumstantial evidence about this, was only partially that, but it was more about encouraging the Israelis to not start another kinetic war. We've now done this, but 20 years ago, we didn't want to do that, right? And so cyber was a way of saying, hey guys, we've got this third option between going to war and doing nothing at all. So don't go to war, right? Let's work together on this. And that was wildly successful, right? Because it bought time for this diplomatic JCPOA environment to get put in place. So that's a great example where you can actually have, intelligence failure, right? We're talking about Stuxnet. It was compromised. And yet, right, it really helps to support this clandestine diplomacy process.
My colleague Adam's going to give you some questions on Iran specifically, but I wanted to kind of come back to this a little bit of kind of two ways that it seems like I've heard of policymakers seeing or interacting with cyber. One is that middle option view, where it's like, hey, between war and do nothing, you pick option two in the middle path of like this thing that's not either one and lets you do something without getting war. And that's one way of viewing it. And, I think we had that view once about sanctions, and they still kind of fill that function. And there's all this debate about how effective sanctions are. And there's certainly some sanctions regimes that are more symbolic than effective. But then the other way of looking at it is, not necessarily the kind of skeptical commander that you described, but someone who's like, oh, cool, I've got this new tool in my toolbox that I can do cyber effects and have those be part of my plan for the operation, just as much as, 5 M1 Abrams tanks are part of my plan for the operation. I know what the Abrams does. I've got all these cyber guys, and they say, and I hear they can do cool stuff, because I've heard from people in the cyber realm where they're like, yeah, we deal with that impression. And they've said, like, I wish I could show people your book so they could understand more about how these exploits work. What do you think about these different dynamics? There's these two kind of ideas. One is that middle option for policymakers where they're like, hey, I've got cyber, it's between war and do nothing. The other is, hey, I've got this new magical tool, where they maybe haven't read your book and think, oh, cyber war, I can call up Cyber Command and they can do cyber war for me, and I can integrate that into my military plans the same way as a Mark 84 bomb or an M1 Abrams tank or something like that. And I've gotten the impression from some folks I've talked to that latter case is a bit of a problem as cyber professionals see it in terms of what they're getting from like military commanders, planners, et cetera. And I feel like you talk about this a bit where it's like, hey, cyber folks may not actually understand the lessons of cyber that you see. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. Okay. So these two options, right? You can think about them in terms of substitutes and complement, right? So in the third option view, right, covert action is classically considered the third option between war and doing nothing, right? So in that sense, right, covert action is a substitute for war. Now, most people recognize it's not a very good substitute for war. Like sanctions are kind of the same thing. Like I want to do something, I can't do nothing, so I'm going to do this, right? And it's like having some like cheap Chinese knockoff of like the really nice luxury good. You're like, okay. And so, most covert action professionals, they may have like great dreams about kind of overthrowing governments, but most of them understand that they're just trying to buy time or create this little marginal advantage. You're not going to conquer a country or change the course of history with covert action. So cyber kind of fits in that, and the more modest we are about, its possibilities, the more we focus on opportunities at the low end of the conflict spectrum, then there's lots of things you can do. And probably intelligence organizations are going to be much more sensitive to this use of cyber. Now, the other one, so if that's the substitute view, the complement view is, hey, cyber is useful not by itself, but integrated with all of these other domains. So we like to talk about the whole multi-domain symphony and everything comes together and we get all of these great effects. And that's wonderful, right? The devil's in the details of actually making that work, right? The United States has been struggling for a century to kind of bring jointness to fruition. And it's amazing what the United States can do as a joint warfighting force, but you only need to spend about an hour in any operational organization to find that jointness starts to fray pretty quickly, right? And it's still hard to get all of these pieces together. It's hard to get these pieces together because they have different cultures, different backgrounds, different languages, different, technological capabilities that they work with. And so, you need everybody cross-trained in everybody else's possibilities, right? Now, you bring in cyber, which has got all of those usual problems of jointness, but is also really, really tied to this intelligence logic, which requires lots and lots of preparation, lots and lots of secrecy, lots of interaction with peacetime organizations. You throw in kind of the civilian industry perspective, and these are things that are useful for the military, but are a very different logic from the way the other services work. So that's tough to bring that together. To the extent that cybercom has been integrated, and I think it has been integrated into military operations, is a real testament to the incredible amount of organizational work that has gone into try to get cybercom and its national mission cyber forces fit into kind of the joint warfighting architecture, right? To create cyber components that look and feel like, air and ground components, and then kind of speak the similar language that can train together, right? And can bring these tools that they can maybe describe their effects to commanders, that they can be integrated within operations. So that's all very, very interesting. Again, that is an organizational story fundamentally, and it's taken a long time for cybercom to build that. But what's actually happening, right? This is a very complementary way of thinking about cyber. As far as we know, and we still know very, very little, we've got these kind of like little tantalizing tidbits of speech by Dan Kane and others that cyber has been used to create these tactical windows to shut down radars or to shut down the lights so that a strike package can get in and out efficiently. That's great, right? So instead of electronic warfare, maybe you're using a little bit of cyber. Now, we can see that the US is also using a lot of electronic warfare. So nobody is dependent on cyber, right? I mean, they're still schwacking radars and putting a lot of jamming out there in the space. So, cyber is being used, and so is everything else, okay? But to the degree cyber is being used, right, it's used as a complement that gives, and the fundamental benefit it gives is efficiency, right? It allows you to use a slightly smaller military force package because you don't have to defend against as many enemy systems. So if you can make it a more pervasive environment that you can get in and out, right? So we've seen cyber certainly used for military operations in that sense, and the goal is to reduce the costs. Which then raises the question of like, well, what do you do in a really, really contested environment where the costs are potentially very, very high? Maybe these things are going to be less useful. What do you do as the war starts to evolve and your pre-conflict assumptions all start to change? Maybe cyber becomes less useful, right? I'm really struck that like cyber seems to be really, really sweet at the beginning of the conflict, right? That's when everything's still, right? And then you can spring the trap. Okay, and you can plan for months, but then once it goes on, like it's actually gets harder and harder to integrate things in a consistent way. So yeah, so I think we kind of end up with this sort of supporting complement rather than this really dramatic substitute.
Looking at the war with Iran, there's been a lot of reporting that stated that Iran's display of its cyber capabilities during the war has been somewhat underwhelming. I would be curious to see how you would rate Iran's performance from what you've seen, and maybe identify some like key factors that have led to that kind of subpar display.
Yeah, I've written about this a little bit. I had a op-ed in the New York Times that was kind of talking about the surprising underperformance of Iran on the cyber side, And the question was, well, how do we explain this? And I just mentioned that because I had quoted the the intelligence community assessment of the cyber portion, which in 2025, right, said, hey, Iran is really interested in infrastructure disruption. They've got a lot of teams that are doing this, and we would expect that a conflict with them is probably going to involve some pretty serious consequences. We haven't seen those serious consequences, right? We've seen some sort of opportunistic hack, like with the Stryker Medical group. That wasn't planned in advance, right? It's more the company just had an open door. They found it, they exploited it quickly, made some noise. Maybe it's a propaganda win, but it clearly wasn't planned in advance. And the question is, well, what happened? And after I published that, someone in the IC came back and they said, well, no. If you look at our 2026 assessment, right, it's much more measured about Iranian capabilities. I'm like, that came out during the war, right? And it mentions the war, right? So like, you're just covering your ass, right? Because like you were wrong a year ago. So anyway, so what happened, right? I think that one possibility is these organizations were always overrated, right? And I would take that very, very seriously. Another possibility, which I also take very seriously, is they've just been hammered, right? We've got lots of reports of the Israelis in particular attacking intelligence headquarters, attacking their cyber headquarters. We know that, the U.S. now has this 10-year-old doctrine of, forward operations. They've got, a decade of experience doing kind of counter-offensive cyber operations against Russia in support of Ukraine, right? So like, I would be shocked, right, and mortified as a taxpayer if Cybercom was not actively going out and tearing down infrastructure on the Iranian side. So like, I think they are just kind of back on their heels, right, offensively. And then another possibility is maybe they're just not as interested in that as people like to focus, right? So I mean, if you're a cyber guy and you want to make cyber important, you tend to emphasize disruption and big espionage attacks, and we then maybe tend to mirror image adversaries and think they want to do that, right? And you look at Iran, you're like, well, their espionage has not been very impressive. Their disruption has not been very impressive. They've gotten in a few places. They've been thrown out all over the place. They seem to be getting hammered by the U.S. and Israel, but, right? Have you seen those Lego videos, right? Have you seen those deep fakes, right? So like on the propaganda side, right, Iran is really cranking out some great stuff, right? Great stuff, right? I mean, effective, we could talk about that, right? But I mean, like, maybe they've just made a decision that like, hey, cyberspace is going to be much more useful for us on the influence side than on the espionage and sabotage side. So that's harder, right? We're more disruptive, but like, let's do this thing because you've got some wide open vulnerabilities and we think we can, make some forward progress there.
Yeah, the propaganda videos thing was actually very interesting. It made me reflect on your subversion chapter because you seem to say, hey, there needs to be a demand signal, and there is, I think a demand, like the U.S. political environment is more permissive because of domestic politics, because there's significant public skepticism of the war, so there's more receptivity to critical messages about the war, regardless of who they're coming from. But what was interesting to me about this is, I'm kind of an Iran guy. I follow it. I've seen some of them. I tend to see them as having fairly low cultural competence toward the West from their security services. I think of things like interrogation accounts where the people interrogating, dual nationals who are held in prison are like very misinformed about like Western culture and society. And then you see, and for instance, some of their 2016 efforts, they were very low quality, very unimpressive. And then the efforts they have today seem much better, seem much more finely attuned. You've seen messages from the Speaker of the Majlis, Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf, getting some play on social media. And you've seen these Lego AI videos. And I mean, honestly, my theory is they are using AI in a way that partially offsets cultural incompetence, that they are better able to interact with the American information environment because they're using tools that have been adapted in a kind of American/Western information environment like LLMs.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you have a feeling for, how closely explosive media and some of these other, production shops are actually integrated with IRGC?
I have no idea. Yeah, and I'm talking. I'm speculating on
We're
all
all
of this here.
spitballing here, right?
I'm not a specialist on
Yeah.
Iranian subversion. I know the older stuff better than the newer stuff. This is just my theory. But yeah, Adam, you wanted to pivot over to Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one expectation before the war started between Russia and Ukraine was, that the cyber operations that would take place, especially offensive cyber operations with Russia, would play a decisive role early on. And, as the war has stretched into its fifth year now, I wonder, like, what have we learned about the actual role and limits of cyber conflict between states that are at war?
Yeah, great question, right? So the Ukraine case was, the major case now of kind of the dog that didn't bark, because, if ever we were going to see cyber have, a decisive impact, you would think that the war in Ukraine, or at least the escalation in 2022, would be it, right? We've got a very competent cyber power. They should be very familiar with Ukraine because they've had 7 years to mess around in their networks. They're going all in with this major regime change operation. Ukraine is a modern industrial society. I mean, they've got vulnerabilities. I mean, this should be it, right? And what do we see? We see these like weirdly uncoordinated wipers, very temporary effects. The biggest thing that happened, right, there was kind of a temporary disruption of some satellite service that had some impact on kind of turbines in Germany, but very little effect operationally on the ground for Ukrainian forces. And we've seen kind of this ongoing evolution of innovation and counter innovation in the cyber realm, but it's a distinctly kind of minor marginal story in Ukraine. Lots of activity, right? Again, like I do not in any way want to minimize or marginalize the degree of effort that goes in and needs to go in on the defensive side to actively kind of counter and parry what the Russians are doing. But the big story in Ukraine, of course, it's missiles and drones and all the tactical innovation that's happening. And that's all really, really important and interesting. And there's a cyber aspect there. Okay. But this is not the story that you would have kind of been given to expect, right? And that's the war where it should have happened, right? I mean, Iran, you can say, well, we expected Iran, but like Iran was always kind of third tier, right? You've got US and Israel at the top. You've got, China and Russia kind of the next tier. Russia had long time been better than China. China's probably better now. And then you've kind of got, everybody else in the middle, North Koreans and Iranians and whatnot. Okay. So like Russia should have been there, but they weren't. And so, well, what the heck happened, right? And, again, we can kind of go through the exercise. Were they not capable of doing it? Why were they not capable? Well, okay, maybe they were as discombobulated as the rest of the Russian invasion. Okay. We've now seen that like the FSB was giving terrible advice to Putin about like what the Ukrainian government was going to do. And, if their cyber planning reflected that at all, then it was probably awful and poorly synchronized with the rest of the campaign. Maybe, right, in those same 7 years, the Ukrainians have gotten much better. In fact, they did, right? I mean, and this is one of my little theories about like why did Putin intervene, and part of it was that like the gray zone third option was really deteriorating, right? I mean, in 2014, Putin could tell himself the story like, well, I'd like to invade Ukraine, but I can't because I don't really want to risk a NATO response. But like this gray zone thing with little green men and cyber and kind of artillery duels, like that might be useful. And maybe I'll be able to kind of erode confidence and Ukraine will eventually fall into my orbit. That's a theory. Turned out to be a bad theory, right? And it was a bad theory, right? Because the West starts kind of flooding all of this support, including a ton of cyber activity. Okay. And so suddenly now that gray zone proposition is a losing one. Ukraine is now tilting firmly into the Western camp, right? Has much more robust defenses. Okay. And so Putin needs to figure like either I write this off altogether or I do something else. And that's a disturbing possibility, right? Because it's like you take away the gray zone pressure release valve, you may push a highly resolved and committed adversary into a more escalatory mode, right? And this is funny because like the cyber war story is, oh, I hit you with a big cyber attack and then somebody else is going to escalate and, and before we know it, we're off to World War III. This is not what happens, right? You're like, I'm really, really good at tamping down your cyber stuff. I've now taken away your third option. I put you in this situation where you now have to figure like, how much do you care about the object? And if you care a lot, then you're going to have to then risk some other domains.
Maybe we could go over one final operation that was brutal, but nevertheless an impressive intelligence operation. I would be curious to see what your thoughts were on the Israeli pager attack against Hezbollah. The pure intricacy of how that was planned and what went into that.
I mean, it's a fascinating case, and for the book, it was great too, because this happened after the book was largely written, and in fact, I was kind of in the copy editing phase, and I told Cornell like this has to be in there, and so like I was kind of able to use it as like, all right, like I can't make the theory fit this case now, right? But I can use the theory to kind of talk about this case. So it was very, very useful. And I used it as a way of saying like, okay, like has the cyber war narrative finally happened? Okay. I mean, this wasn't cyber per se, but if cyber is control and communications, then like it is definitely cyber adjacent, right? So you've got kind of a communications intelligence operation that has lethal effects at scale, that is followed by a large scale escalation. So I mean, like that kind of sounds like the cyber war narrative. There are some really important disanalogies, and I think those are important, right? You didn't use code to cause the problem, right? You actually had Mossad physically tamper with and sabotage these things, so the pages were turned into IEDs rather than logic bombs. So that's important, right? The other thing is that the pager attacks were incorporated into the Israeli campaign plan, right? So the idea is we're going to like do this leadership decapitation and then airstrikes and then a ground invasion. So you're like, oh, okay, like that's that complementary story where you're just going to open with this decapitation attack, which is, again, that's the classic Israeli and American way of war. We've just are using some different tools to do it. Now, you're right. I mean, like the intricacies and the planning that went involved are amazing, right? I mean, reports vary, but I mean, it was at least 2 and maybe as many as 10 years of planning that went into this. It was super, super devious, right? You wanted the Hezbollah leadership to understand that their cell phones were vulnerable and they needed to go somewhere else. And then you offered them that alternative that was more secure, right, but was actually less secure. So you gave them the noose to hang themselves. And then you had this thing in your hand. You're like, we get to use this once, right? Once we push the button, right, it's going to reveal it, like game over. So let's make sure it works. And one of the things we don't know is like, what was the timeline? Did they feel that was there an operational security concern that actually advanced the timeline? Maybe they went earlier than they had to. I don't know. This is one of the many mysteries that are out there. But I think that it is helpful to understand this as a way of showing, what, when conditions are right and you've got an actor that is well prepared and well integrated, then cyber can provide this efficiency advantage. So I would definitely call that like a big success that then translates into maybe not grand strategic success because we're still dealing with this, but like strategically, Israel was able to like really, knock Hezbollah back on its heels for 2 years, right? So that I think like it was one of these very rare kind of shining success stories. Now, grand strategically, that's a different story.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like the IDF had been warning for many years, hey, the next fight with Hezbollah is going to be really ugly from the jump and it's going to be big. And it didn't quite look like that, which, would imply that it created a new operational space for them that's, more favorable to the Israelis, but also potentially resulted in less destruction relative to the kind of big war that you can see, IDF commanders warning about for many, many years ahead of this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I complained a little bit about kind of, grand strategic, knock-on effects. There's some interesting suggestion. Roland Bergman, as in the New York Times, has talked a little bit about like the pager operation kind of contributing to this hubris in the Israeli intelligence community, right? That just made them feel that like they're so smart, so technically savvy, so untouchable that Iran was going to be easier than it's turned out to be. And that was a big part of the sales job, that was given to the Trump administration. So, again, that's one of these kind of like long range, maybe downsides of like being catastrophically successful with this piece.
Well, I mean, Ronan Bergman has argued the same thing about their targeted killing program. And I think, one of the things I've thought about, one of the narratives I've heard about why they triggered the pagers tool when they did was that they, were concerned that it was about to be discovered.
Yeah.
Because that's potentially a more concerning framing of the operation. If it's
Yep.
like, hey, it's this awesome but vulnerable exploit, it could create an escalation pressure. If you
Super,
saw that
super
same
fragile.
dynamic play out in other places.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is real, right? Because again, like what's the primary advantage it gives you? Efficiency, but it's efficiency that's very, very sensitive. So like you think that you can get a big payoff for a low investment, but as long as it stays secret. And so the problems are that like you've got this asymmetry of power. You can't communicate to the other side. You can't use it for coercion. You can't say, hey, Hezbollah, give up or we're going to like blow up all of your leadership. You just can't say that, right? So like all you can do is go to war, right? And the war has to be a surprise attack. If it's going to be a surprise attack, well, you better make it, a land air campaign as well. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right? And the mechanism there is not, it's not the cyber or the intel per se, but it's the secrecy that creates, a lack of mutual knowledge about the balance of power. That is the real danger.
All right. The book is Age of Deception, Cybersecurity as Secret Statecraft. I believe it's still open access on
It
JSTOR,
is
by the way.
in perpetuity, yes. So you
That is
definitely.
very cool. Yeah. So you can go read chapters from this, some really fascinating case studies. Dr. John Lindsay, thank you for coming on Security Dilemma.
Great. Thanks so much. This has been a blast.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy-Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security Dilemma.